Great. For Jim Eliot, Sociology Department, new arrival to Rice. I'll be co-presenting, as Randall pointed out, with Kyle Shelton, newly arrived to Rice. And before we get started, we want to add just our thanks to Dominic and I don't know if Andrea's here for putting on the symposium, but more importantly, I think, for founding the center, which is just a wonderful piece of intellectual life here at Rice. And I'd add a necessary piece, one that's actually encouraged and provided the space for Kyle and I to arrive just a few months ago and begin to brainstorm new projects and think about how we can use Houston as a laboratory to get at some of the things we'd like to do with urbanization. And so again, I'm a sociologist, Kyle's a historian, and what we wanted to do as we got to Houston is think about what is Houston and what makes it work. And many of you went out to, I think, the ship channel tour yesterday and took the ship and went down there, and we did the same thing. And we looked around and we said, wow, if Houston is sort of this laboratory for understanding urbanization in 21st century America, then the port is a good piece of that to try to unpack that. And in doing that, we're very interested in thinking about the port and the processes that give rise to it, which come from it, thinking about that as a socio-environmental form. So when we talk about the nature of urban ports, we're really trying to get at this notion, unpack or diffuse the binary between nature and society. So similar to some of the earlier presenters as well. So the question then becomes, how are we going to do this? So what I'm going to do is try to provide some of the overview, and then I'm going to hand it over to Kyle, and he's going to go through some of the historical dimensions, the empirical dimensions of the project, and then hand it back to me as we look sort of forward. What you didn't see on your ship tour yesterday probably is the number of jurisdictions that you actually go through, and you can't even see this on this map. This is a map that was created by one of our colleagues here at the Shell Sustainability Center, Lester King, but there are actually many different complexities. And this is one of the things that sort of struck us as we decided to get together and put our heads around the port or the ship channel of Houston. Like, what is this? How do you gain access to it? What does it mean? So this is sort of the motivating question. And in terms of my own work, Kyle and I are continuing to think about this, but I'm interested in this notion of urbanization as a form of socio-environmental succession. So what this does is it takes the city and sort of begins to think of it, again, as a process, like many of us have been doing, thinking about it as a dynamic form. And it's a dynamic form in which nature and society are or mutually produced as they sort of move together. So one of the analytical challenges for sociologists is to think about the different gears or types of infrastructures that might move together gradually over time in ways we might not immediately appreciate when we're on the boat tour or when we're sitting in our offices or we're taking a tour of the downtown tunnels. And so this is a heuristic device to begin thinking about the environment, which has been radically changed along the ship channel, not only to deepen it and allow ships to go back and forth, but also in terms of the petrochemical complex that has given rise to our moniker of the carbon capital of the world and what that's done to the environment in and around the ship channel. So the environment over there is in that circle, a sort of piece that's there. And then there's the socio-demographic forms, how different groups come into the city and move around different neighborhoods slowly over time, moving in to work the ship channel, moving out as they gain middle class incomes, making room for other groups that have come into that space over time, the challenges they face, and the industrial transformation of nature. But what we want to do today is, in high relief, I probably should have made this more dynamic, but focus on the risk and governance component of this infrastructure of the gear. How is it that government and regulation gets involved slowly over time and begins to accumulate and work with these other factors? So the grand goal over time is that we can begin to put all of these cogs or infrastructures, the social infrastructure of neighborhoods that comprise cities, in this case Houston, the environmental transformation, the industrial churning, the coming and going of different industries and technologies into play. But we're really going to focus, the one we're going to zoom in on today is the risk and governance. So how are we going to get at this sort of process? Well, one way in invoking the concept of secession, I don't know how many of you are familiar with classical sociology, but it began in the United States in Chicago as an attempt to actually understand the chaos that the city seemed to present. And so at the time, the 19-teens, 20s, what sociologists like Robert Park and Ernest Burgess did is they reached across campus and borrowed techniques and methods from the plant and animal ecologists who were also trying to understand things. And so they did it in a number of different ways. We might get into Q&A, but one of the ways they did is basically focus on the territorial dimensions. They jettisoned the environment from the plant and animal ecologists, but they kept their idea that you could begin to map different land users and different sections of the city. And then once you do that, you can begin to posit different models. So these are different models that various urban ecologists came up with that are produced by urbanization. And we can debate which one's relevant and if any of them are relevant. But the point we want to make is these are actually dynamic. They're static diagrams here, but the idea is that once these zones get developed, these natural areas as they call them back in the 1920s and 30s in the city, what happens is that each one of these zones, a central business district, manufacturing or transport corridor, begin to take on a life of their own, so that urbanization as a process actually becomes somewhat endogenous. Once the zones get created, once the ship channel is put in place, once the central business district's in place, once the high-end residential neighborhood's in place, the arrow of time and how that city works sort of begins to bend through those spaces, and it's really the interaction of those spaces with one another that drives urbanization at the local scale. So they posited, they being the early urban ecologists, that this all happens without much planning. In the 19-teens and 20s, there wasn't a lot of urban planning. There was platting and gridding and selling of real estate. There were growth machines that began to develop. But a lot of this just sort of seemed to bubble up and be natural. So Houston makes an interesting case because in many respects it is the least zoned, least planned city in the US. It is the Chicago of the 21st century. And so the question then becomes, as you look at these things, how is it that these zones, whether it be in older US cities or more contemporary Houston, once they're established, and they're not really established through direct top-down planning, how do those zones actually become to sort of get enmeshed and generate their own regulatory structures and infrastructures over time in unanticipated ways that accumulate in ways that actually begin to insulate them from other zones in the city, and not only that, but insulate them from civic engagement. This is the puzzle that we had in talking to environmental justice folks in town, and then telling it's just damn impossible to know who to talk to, who's in charge, what's happening. How did that happen? So that's sort of the process. We want to go back, rehabilitate, at least I do a little bit, rehabilitate some of the urban ecology, invoke political action, and reintegrate environmental constructions and sort of processes into that. So how do we do this? Somebody asked a great question yesterday, I thought, about scale and how that works. You know, is it that we can look to the local as maybe an opportunity to develop solutions to some of the pressing problems presented by climate change? And or how do we reconcile that with these larger structures? And in geography, but mainly environmental urban sociology, there's increasingly this understanding of a common sequence where we start to get sort of politicization and reflexivity of sort of development over time that brings these regulatory issues to the fore as we change nature. So the basic sequence that I'll highlight and then hand it over to Kyle to sort of illustrate some of these things is that oftentimes we have a big actor, a central state, a federal government oftentimes that comes in to an area and invests in a major infrastructure. So in Houston, that happened in the early 1900s. Houston had always tried to displant and displace Galveston as the major port of this area of the Gulf. It wasn't until a number of sort of incidental sort of overlaps between the Galveston hurricane and various things that the central state was finally encouraged to come up to Houston and develop a deep water port here because it would be relatively protected, given that it's 50, 60 miles up the channel from the Galveston Bay. We'll come back to that at the end. So the central state comes in, leverages the infrastructural development of the ship channel, and then hands it over to the local growth machine or the political coalition that wants to develop that area industrially for profits and power that go along with it. As that happens over time, successively local environmental groups begin to sort of activate in response to perceived and real environmental risks created by that transformation of nature and that building of that infrastructure, in this case, the ship channel. And then as a result, we begin to see at various levels, from the federal to the state to the local, various attempts to establish regulations or what we might call risk containment activities to sort of keep the risks that are created by the development of the ship channel contained so that they're acknowledged and legitimated, but at the same time addressed and negotiated in a way that allows local infrastructure to continue bringing up oil and continue to develop the petrochemical complex that's developed along that. So again, what I'm going to do is hand it over to Kyle. He's going to talk a little bit about how these regulatory risk containment strategies have sort of begun to sort of take shape and unfold and wrap around, if you will, metaphorically, the ship channel over time.
Thanks, Jim. Since we are not designers, I'm going to continue with the next PowerPoint template here that just kind of drills down into that last arrow that Jim talked about briefly. This is sort of how we frame the local examples that I'm going to go through really quickly. So we broke the post-World War II ship channel history into roughly 3 periods where we saw this sort of process playing out. The 1960s and 1970s and sort of the first environmental movement, the 1980s and the community right to know push that happened then, and then brought it up to today to talk about chemical security. And what I'm going to really quickly trace in each of those 3 periods is this cycle, which really builds off of what Jim just showed. So there's some type of environmental crisis or a governance crisis. There's a popular movement or a public demand to address that. The large actor, usually the federal government, attempts to put in a regulatory response. And then in the Houston case, but I think pretty much everywhere what we're arguing is that then the corporate and local governments that are really invested in the success of these industrial areas sort of refract and change the regulatory push made by the major actor in ways that allow the economic development to continue and the risks to accumulate, while at the same time saying that they are attempting to regulate the space. And for the ship channel in particular, what we're going to see in each of these 3 segments is that the federal responses are limited by these 3 things. Ineffective regulations, right? The environmental regulations of the 1970s didn't address all of the problems, so there's another segment of issues that grow. Greater security measures, that's going to particularly apply in the most recent example, the post 9/11 world. And then just a lack of public oversight from some other governance structures that I'm going to touch on here. So in Houston, the 3 kind of local governance things that we wanted to highlight before we got into the case studies were all kind of land use governance systems that have existed, that began in the 1960s and then touch on the limited purpose annexations of today. All 3 of these kind of serve to separate industrial areas, and in this case, the port, from the general functioning of the city or some levels of oversight within city government, right? So extraterritorial jurisdiction is a peculiarity to Texas, which allows cities to grow to massive statures. So that's why Houston and Dallas have humongous city limits. Houston's up to now 630 square miles. And what it basically means is that the city itself can control the territory without formally annexing it. And for a long time, much of the ship channel was in territorial jurisdiction, and that simply meant that there were fewer constraints even within Houston's very low regulatory environment on the spaces there. Industrial districts do much the same thing, and they've become more popular in recent years and teamed with limited purpose annexations. I'm pointing to my computer screen so you can see it. This is a map of the current industrial districts around the Houston Ship Channel. And so together, districts and limited purpose annexations sort of amplify what the extraterritorial jurisdiction does. Cities can enter into agreements with industrial facilities where they basically get a quid pro quo of, I will give you services, you will give me 50% of your property tax value, so you save some tax. I don't have to give you all of the services, I just give you the bare minimum of water. And then again, it allows the industry themselves to regulate their growth. So there's less oversight on their development, there's less oversight on their new construction. And as you can see, it's a very popular tact in Houston. So to get into the sort of 3 case studies really quickly and the Houston-specific versions of it, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on each of these, but I just wanted to outline them. So what we see in the 1970s and 1960s really is the growth of the environmental movement and awareness that there are a lot of problems, especially around industrial areas. And so that eventually leads to the regulatory response of the whole slate of environmental laws in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And those did a lot of very good things. It increased citizen participation, it allowed citizens and environmental groups to sue companies for the first time in really important ways. The EPA grows and is pretty strong at the first stage, and it established standards on pollution that didn't exist prior to that. But then what we see in Houston and other places is that local governments and industries find ways around a lot of that regulation. So initially, industries shift to polluting to ground because the first round of pollution controls focused on air and water pollution. So companies say, okay, we'll stop doing that and we'll just put it on our own property. And you see from all levels of government sort of the corporate government connection and favoritism playing out. The best Houston example is one of the first EPA lawsuits was against Armco Steel along the Houston Ship Channel. The EPA successfully won one of their first lawsuits and was going to require Armco to put in a number of checks on their air and water pollution. And only months after the successful conclusion of the case, a consent decree was agreed upon that really changed the punishment for Armco and allowed them to kind of continue business as usual. And then a few months after that agreement was reached, it came out that the White House had actually pressured the EPA to move to a more lenient position. So this is what we're talking about when we say that the folks who are very closely connected to the major polluters, both federally in that case, but also locally, can sort of change the way the laws are supposed to be implemented. We see that again and again. So given that they don't succeed fully, right, there are lots of still really rampant pollution problems along the Ship Channel, what happened here was that there's sort of this next wave, right? So we put in place all the federal legislation, some things improve, but there's now pollution to ground, there's a new set of problems, and what we talk about in the paper that we've written attached to this is that in addition to the local problems, the national and international issues that arise in the 1980s, everything from Bhopal to Lake Canal, where sort of the toxic risks associated with those very public accidents propel this next form of public push to move ahead. And I'm going to speed through and I'm happy to talk about the other examples. But what we see is then after the Right to Know Acts are put in place in the 1980s, companies again figure out ways to move around that. So the local example we talked about is citizen advisory panels through the chemical security or through the chemical sector here, which would basically become like a public a way to say, well, look at all the stuff that we're doing here. We're engaging with the public. We're trying to show you the information, but they have no regulatory teeth, and they're actually just a way to move around the regulation. And in the security case, this is an interesting one because we see citizens kind of inverting the process that we've talked about in the 70s and the 80s. So the local government has obviously increased security a great deal along the Ship Channel, and this really amplifies the stuff with the special districts and the limited purpose annexation that I touched on earlier, where the space is simply removed from the public consciousness even more, right? And that serves a very legitimate security purpose, but it also continues to separate these industrial spaces from the common conversation happening in Houston and our idea of how we control those. So there are some environmental justice groups now working to use that, the threat of terrorism and the threat of instability of these places as a way to also encourage new environmental regulations. And I'm happy to expand on that in the Q&A. But this is kind of the result that we've seen, and this is again by our colleague, the Shell Center. Basically what we see is the regulations that have been put in place have not actually stopped the pollution to any great extent, but instead simply drawn a wall in between the citizens of Houston over here on the right at their playground and the polluting industries along the ship channel. And another way to show that and show the complication of this, and this is a thing we're still trying to wrap our heads around, these are a very brief collection of the numbers of entities who either have direct jurisdictional control over some element of the ship channel or are very closely invested. And I can tell you a little bit more about who those groups are in Q&A. But Jim's just going to wrap up here.
And each one of those numbers has multiple layers. That's sort of the most abstract. So congratulations for those of you who took the ship channel tour. You got about the maximum access you can get to knowing this stuff. So I'll just finish real quickly because I got this on. This is under the sort of the notion of succession. Things are cumulative and they sort of change in largely unplanned, unanticipated ways that are difficult to reverse. So these things sort of build on each other, the regulations build on each other. So it's hard to see with the red dots, but those illustrate about 4,200 above ground storage tanks that now hold hazardous material along the ship channel. So this is part of what the regulation is allowed to do, change nature into things that we now worry about that are along that ship channel. And I'm now involved with some engineers here on campus and some lawyers to think about what that would mean. And their goal, at least now, is to transform nature some more. I don't have time to get into this, but this is a diagram about how to build a protection system, a sea gate that would protect these above ground storage tanks from storm surge and high winds in the case of a hurricane. The hurricane's coming. A 5 to 10% failure rate of these above ground storage tanks, which are not built to withstand high winds, and if water rises, they will float off and discharge. 5 to 10%, I think, 10% failure rate effectively kills all life in Galveston Bay. So for what that's worth, that would transform nature even more. Thank you.